The institution that controls the price of money is the most powerful institution on earth. And for over 100 years, the Federal Reserve has operated as a state within a state. It is a fortress of technocratic power designed to be insulated from the whims of voters and the desperation of politicians who always want lower rates and easier money. We are taught in school that this independence is sacred and necessary for a stable economy. We are told that the Fed is the guardian of the currency, acting as a neutral arbiter that balances employment and inflation without regard for the next election cycle or the polling numbers of the president. But what if that independence was just a handshake agreement that is about to be broken? What if the legal walls protecting the money printer from the White House were much thinner than we thought and could be knocked down with a single executive order? And what happens when a president decides to tear them down to fund a massive political agenda? In 2025, the handshake agreement is ending. Hidden deep within the 900-page policy blueprint known as Project 2025 is a plan that effectively ends the Federal Reserve as we know it. This is not just about tweaking interest rates or auditing the books for transparency. It is a structural revolution that changes the very nature of the American dollar. It is the Unitary Executive theory applied to the creation of money itself. The plan argues that the Constitution creates a single executive branch, and that every agency within it, including the Federal Reserve, must ultimately answer to the President of the United States. It proposes stripping the Fed of its autonomy, forcing its regulatory decisions to go through the White House Office of Management and Budget, and potentially removing the dual mandate that has guided American economic policy for decades. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we have to look at the history of central banking in the United States. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 specifically to stop panics and to act as a lender of last resort that could provide liquidity when the private sector froze. For most of its history, it was subservient to the Treasury Department. During World War II, the Fed pegged interest rates to help the government fund the war effort, ensuring that borrowing costs remained low despite the massive spending. It was only with the Treasury-Fed Accord of 1951 that the modern era of independence truly began. That accord was a peace treaty between the bankers and the politicians. The politicians agreed to stop pressuring the bankers so the bankers could stop inflation. Project 2025 is the revocation of that treaty. The document explicitly critiques the operational ineffectiveness of the Fed and suggests radical alternatives ranging from a return to a commodity-backed currency like a gold standard to a system of free banking where private banks issue their own notes. But while the document pays lip service to hard money conservatives who want gold, the mechanism of control it establishes hands the weapon to the politicians. If the president can fire the Fed chair for policy disagreements, a power Trump has long asserted, he as then the president sets interest rates. This is the secret core of the plan, which is often overlooked by mainstream analysts. It is not really about returning to gold, because that is the window dressing for the ideological base. It is about seizing the money printer to service the political agenda. When you look at the advisors surrounding the former president, you do not see gold bugs who want a stable currency. You see advocates of the Mar-a-Lago Accord, a strategy to intentionally devalue the US dollar to boost exports and re-industrialize the Midwest. You see economists who argue that trade deficits are the enemy and that a strong dollar is a weakness that hurts American workers. If the Fed is independent, it fights inflation by raising rates, which strengthens the dollar and hurts exports. If the Fed is captured by the White House, it cuts rates to juice the stock market and weaken the dollar regardless of what inflation is doing. This is the Turkey model. In Turkey, President Erdogan believes that high interest rates cause inflation contrary to all economic science and fires central bankers who refuse to cut rates. The result was inflation topping 80% and the destruction of the middle-class savings. Project 2025 provides the legal framework to bring a sophisticated version of that philosophy to Washington, D.C. The plan also targets the regulatory power of the Fed, which is just as important as interest rates. By forcing the Fed to submit its banking regulations to the White House for review, the president gains the power to punish or reward specific banks based on their lending practices. Imagine a scenario where banks that lend to disfavored industries, perhaps green energy or DEI initiatives, face crushing regulatory scrutiny, while banks that fund favored industries get a free pass. The allocation of capital ceases to be a market function driven by profit and risk and becomes a political patronage system driven by loyalty. This is the definition of crony capitalism enforced by the central bank. Critics argue this will destroy the credibility of the US dollar globally. The status of the dollar as the world reserve currency rests entirely on trust. Trust that the Fed will not debase the currency to bail out the government. If that trust is broken, if global investors believe the Fed is just an arm of the campaign, the exorbitant privilege of the United States evaporates instantly. Bond yields would spike as foreign nations dump treasuries. The cost of everything imported from electronics to coffee would explode. But the architects of this plan are betting on something else. They are betting that the U.S. is too big to fail. They believe they can weaponize the dollar to fight a trade war, force the Fed to monetize the debt, and use the resulting boom to solidify political power. They are treating the economy not as a delicate ecosystem, but as a political engine to be redlined. And the first step in redlining an engine is removing the governor. The Federal Reserve is that governor. And in 2025, it is scheduled to be removed. The conflict at the heart of this Federal Reserve takeover is a contradiction that threatens to tear the American economy apart. On one side, you have the sound money rhetoric found in the text of Project 2025 chapters written by Heritage Foundation scholars who pine for the stability of the 19th century gold standard. They argue that fiat money is the root of all evil, enabling the welfare state and endless wars, and they want to abolish the Fed to stop the printing. But on the other side, you have the political reality of the MAGA economic agenda, which is fundamentally inflationary. You cannot have a trade war mass, deportations, tax cuts, and a manufacturing boom without massive amounts of easy money. You cannot reindustrialize America with high interest rates. This is where the Mar-a-Lago Accord comes into play. It is an idea floated by the inner circle of economic advisors to intentionally devalue the US dollar by 20 to 30%. The logic is simple. A cheaper dollar makes American cars, and steel cheaper for foreigners to buy, boosting exports and creating jobs. It makes foreign goods expensive for Americans, encouraging them to buy American. It is a classic protectionist strategy that has been used by developing nations for decades. But there is a catch. To devalue the dollar, you have to print more of them. You have to flood the global market with greenbacks to drive the price down relative to other currencies. You have to slash interest rates to zero or even negative to make holding dollars unattractive to foreign investors. The Heritage Foundation writes about price stability, but the Trump advisors talk about competitive devaluation. These two goals are mutually exclusive. You cannot have a stable gold-backed dollar and a devalued export-boosting dollar at the same time. History tells us which faction usually wins in a populist regime: the inflationists. Why is this the case? Because deflation is painful. A return to the gold standard would require a massive contraction of the money supply, which would cause a depression that would make 1929 look mild. No president, especially one obsessed with popularity and stock market records, will voluntarily trigger a depression to satisfy an ideological commitment to gold. Instead, they will use the powers seized under Project 2025 to do the exact opposite of what the text of the document suggests. They will use the Unitary Executive authority to force the Fed to accommodate massive fiscal deficits. This is the inflation bomb. Consider the proposed policies. A 10% universal tariff on all imports coupled with even higher tariffs on specific nations. Tariffs are taxes on consumers. They raise the price of goods. Mass deportations of undocumented labor, which restricts the labor supply, driving up wages and costs in agriculture, construction, and hospitality. Extension of the 2017 tax cuts, which increases the deficit. In a normal world, the Federal Reserve would look at these inflationary policies and raise interest rates to cool the economy down. They would act as the adult in the room, taking away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. This would offset the stimulus, but also crash the stock market and slow down growth. But under the Project 2025 framework, the adult in the room has been fired. The new Fed chair handpicked for loyalty will be ordered to keep rates low despite the rising inflation. They will be told to look at alternative data or to focus on manufacturing health rather than consumer prices. This leads to a phenomenon known as fiscal dominance. This occurs when the debt of the government is so high and its spending needs so great that the central bank loses the ability to set monetary policy. It must print money to fund the government regardless of inflation. The fiscal authority dominates the monetary authority. We saw this in the 1940s when the Fed capped rates to fund the war. We saw it in 1970s Britain. We are seeing it now in emerging markets. But we have never seen it in the modern era of the US dollar. The secret plan is not to fix the money, it is to break the thermometer. By taking control of the Fed, the administration can suppress the signals that usually warn of economic danger. Bond yields or interest rates on debts are the way the market screams risk. But if the Fed is ordered to buy unlimited bonds known as yield curve control, the alarm bell is silenced. The result is a period of sugar-high prosperity where stocks soar, wages rise in nominal terms, and factories open, followed by the inevitable crash of purchasing power. The dollar in your pocket rots from the inside out. You might have twice as much money, but a loaf of bread costs 3 times as much. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is the blueprint for this devaluation. It frames the strong dollar not as a symbol of American strength, but as a shackle on American industry. Breaking that shackle means breaking the purchasing power of the middle class. It is a transfer of wealth, from savers who hold dollars to debtors who owe dollars and exporters who earn foreign currency. The Project 2025 document is the legal crowbar used to pry open the doors of the Federal Reserve. Once inside, the plan is not to admire the gold, it is to turn the dial on the printer to infinity to finance the industrial ambitions of the state. Why would they do this? Why would any government intentionally court inflation knowing the political risks and the damage it causes to the citizenry? The answer lies in the one number that terrifies Washington more than any other $35 trillion. The United States national debt is mathematically unpayable in constant dollars. We have borrowed from the future to fund the wars, welfare, and tax cuts of the present. The interest payments alone are now exceeding the defense budget. We are borrowing more money just to pay the interest on the old money. This is the debt spiral, and it inevitably leads to a terminal phase for the currency. There are only 3 ways out of a debt spiral. First is austerity. You cut spending and raise taxes to pay it back. This is political suicide. No population will vote for a 50% cut in their standard of living. Second is default. You simply refuse to pay. You tell China, Japan, and your own pension funds that their treasury bonds are worthless. This creates a global financial collapse and destroys the creditworthiness of the nation for a century. Third is financial repression, or inflation. You print the money to pay the debt. You pay back the bonds in nominal terms you promised. $100, you pay $100, but that $100 now only buys a pack of gum. You inflate the debt away. Option 3 is the only politically viable path. It is the soft default. It is the path nations always choose when faced with unpayable debts. Project 2025 is the operational manual for option 3. To inflate away the debt, you need interest rates to be below the rate of inflation. If inflation is 5% and interest rates are 3%, the real value of the debt shrinks by 2% every year. The government is effectively getting paid to borrow money. But a free market will not allow this. In a free market, if inflation is 5%, bondholders will demand 7 or 8% interest to protect themselves. They will sell bonds driving rates up. To force rates down, you need a captive central bank. You need a Federal Reserve that is willing to buy every bond the market sells. You need a Fed that ignores the inflation target and focuses on debt sustainability or financing the agenda of the administration. This is why Federal Reserve independence is the primary target of Project 2025. An independent Fed might try to save the currency. A captured Fed will save the government. We are moving toward a period of financial repression. This is a term coined by economists to describe policies that channel funds from the private sector to the government to liquidate debt. It involves caps on interest rates, so you're not allowed to earn a real yield on your savings. It involves capital controls, so you are not allowed to move your money out of the country to escape the inflation. It involves regulatory mandates, where pension funds and retirement accounts are legally required to buy government debt even though it is a losing investment. The proposal to politicize the money printer is a desperate defensive measure against the debt trap. The architects of Project 2025 know that the one big beautiful bill, or whatever fiscal stimulus is planned, will blow out the deficit even further. They know the bond market. The bond vigilantes will revolt. They need the Fed to step in and crush that revolt. They are preparing for a war with the bond market. And in that war, your savings are the collateral damage. When they talk about free banking or gold, they are distracting you. The real action is in the emergency authorities. The executive orders drafted for day 1 will likely declare a national economic emergency. This gives the president sweeping powers under the Trading with the Enemy Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. These powers could be used to freeze assets, seize gold as FDR did in 1933, or force the repatriation of corporate cash held overseas. But the most effective emergency power is simply ordering the Fed to monetize the debt. The narrative will be framed as patriotic. They will say we are under attack by globalist speculators. They will say we need to lower rates to rebuild America. They will say the deficit does not matter because we owe it to ourselves. But the math does not care about patriotism. When you increase the supply of money faster than the supply of goods, prices rise. When you use the central bank to fund the government, you turn the currency into a political token. The $35 trillion debt is the gun pointed at the head of the American economy. Project 2025 is the plan to pull the trigger, but to aim the bullet at the purchasing power of the dollar, rather than the solvency of the state. They are choosing to bankrupt you to save the system. So what does the Federal Reserve Takeover mean for you and your financial future? It means the rules of the game are changing. The strategy of save cash, buy bonds, retire on a fixed income is a suicide pact in a regime of financial repression. If the secret plan succeeds, we will enter an era of secular inflation. This is not the 2% inflation of the past. It is a volatile, sticky 4 to 8% inflation that eats your wealth alive. Your savings account paying 0.5% interest is losing 7% of its value every year. In a decade, half your purchasing power is gone. Your long-term bonds, the safe portion of your portfolio, will crash in real value. Your wage increases will lag behind the cost of living. This is the liquidation of the middle class. It is the transfer of real wealth from those who hold paper currency to those who hold hard assets. The winners in this scenario are the debtors. If you have a massive 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, you win. You are paying back the bank with devalued dollars. The government wins for the same reason. The winners are the owners of scarce tangible assets, real estate, farmland, commodities, businesses with pricing power. The losers are the prudent, the savers, the retirees living on pensions, the people who trusted the dollar. This is why you see the strategic Bitcoin reserve mentioned alongside these plans. Some factions within the new right understand exactly where this is going. They know the dollar is being sacrificed. They are positioning Bitcoin not just as a speculative asset, but as a neutral reserve asset to hedge against the very debasement they are planning to unleash. If the US government starts buying Bitcoin, it is a signal that they have lost faith in their own paper. It is an admission that the fiat experiment is ending, and they need a lifeboat. So how do you protect yourself? You have to front-run the Mar-a-Lago Accord. You have to position yourself for a weaker dollar and higher inflation. First, get out of cash. Keep only what you need for emergencies. Cash is the asset that is being targeted for destruction. Second, own hard assets. Gold is the traditional hedge against a rogue central bank. When the Fed loses credibility, gold makes new highs. It is the only money that is not someone else's liability. Third, understand Bitcoin. Whether you like crypto or not, you must understand its role as a digital gold that cannot be debased by an executive order. If the administration creates a strategic reserve, the price will erate instantly. Fourth, utilize fixed-rate debt. If you can borrow money at a fixed rate to buy a cash-flowing asset like a rental property, you are effectively shorting the dollar. You are betting that the money you pay back will be worth less than the money you borrowed. The Project 2025 plan to seize the Federal Reserve is the crossing of the Rubicon. It marks the end of the post-World War II financial order. It is the moment where politics fully consumes economics. They will tell you it is for Main Street. They will tell you it is to make America wealthy again. But you cannot print wealth. You can only print receipts for wealth. And when you print too many receipts, the people holding them realize they have been swindled. The takeover is coming. The independence of the Fed is ending. The money printer is being politicized. The only question left is, are you holding the paper, or are you holding the assets that the paper buys? I am Tom, and this is The Wealth Collapse. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you will want to be one of the few who saw it coming.